Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. In this podcast, we are going to explore the Godfather paradox. We start with the novel The Godfather by Mario Puzo. We explore the behavior and temperament of the Godfather. We go on to discuss what it is to be a socially enabled psychopath. We discuss links in neuroscience and popular culture. And we will talk more about who is a socially enabled psychopath and what makes a socially enabled psychopath. Now, The Godfather, the novel, and then the movies, of course, came out years and years ago. And just to recount his story, he was born in Corleone, a small village in Sicily. He earned his stripes as a young boy, learning to use the Sicilian gun, the Lupara. He spent his early years in New York as a humble immigrant, barely making ends meet. Eventually, his life led him into the grey underbelly of the New York underworld after he shrewdly murdered a local don. And emerging from these violent beginnings, he eventually metamorphosed into the Godfather, and someone who repeatedly in the novel is referred to as a reasonable man. Now, why am I so fascinated by The Godfather? Because The Godfather, both the novel and the movie and the way the character was constructed, is a very good example of psychopathy, but psychopathy that is socially enabled and makes a person extremely functioning. Let's go back and ask ourselves about the mind of a psychopath. The prototypal psychopath has deficits or deviances in some core areas. Problems with interpersonal relationships, problems with emotional expression, and problems with self-control. They often gain satisfaction through antisocial or socially deviant behavior. They do not experience shame, guilt, or remorse for their actions. And this is very, very important to remember. Psychopaths may express guilt or remorse, but they don't feel it. They don't experience it. They do not realize deep within them that they've done something wrong. They lack a sense of guilt or remorse for any harm that they may have caused others. Instead, what they tend to do is rationalize their behavior, blame it on others, or deny it outright. The most important psychopathic quality, perhaps, is the absence or lack of empathy, the ability to feel other people's emotions. And this results often in tactlessness, insensitivity, and contemptuousness. However, they do have a superficial charm about them, and this is enabled by willingness to say anything without concern for accuracy or truth. They also have what's called a shallow affect, which is they don't really feel anything deeply, but they pretend to feel. They pretend very well to feel happy or sad or appreciative or guilty, and these emotions are, because they pretend, they tend to be very short and they tend to be easily forgotten. The average psychopath is impulsive and irresponsible in his behavior, often fails to keep a job, often defaults on debts. They also have a markedly distorted sense of the potential consequences of their actions, not only for others, but also for themselves. One of the things that you will come across very often is of people doing things which are wrong in public view, but believing that they will not be caught. And that's very typical of psychopathy. They don't recognize the inherent risk of being caught, disbelieved, or injured as a result of their behavior. Despite all this, a lot of psychopaths are very good at making a good first impression on you. Emotionally, the fundamental traits that underlie this personality are this inability to empathize, the inability to feel other people's emotions, the inability to share truly their love, joy, pain, and sorrow in a deep way. And the emotions that this person experiences are distinctly shallow and poorly sustained. It's not that the psychopath does not feel the emotions. He or she feels them so fleetingly and is so transiently carried away by them, perhaps even intensely carried away by them, that these emotions fail to have an impact, a true impact, on how he or she perceives the world and reacts to the emotions of others. In other words, the emotional experience of the psychopath probably has little impact on his emotional learning and development as a human being. They also don't understand right and wrong in conventional ways as accepted by society. They often choose to operate from their own reality framework. They do not necessarily fit within the moral and legal framework that we all accept as a society. And therefore, from Al Pacino to Veerappan, real-life godfathers have been intensely proud men who are not afraid to write their own rule books, who judge right and wrong in their unique ways, who seldom appear to feel and certainly do not express remorse for their actions, however impactful they may be. Yet, what is very interesting is that functional psychopaths may often come across as reasonable men. And this is where we go back to Mario Puzo's Godfather. What is fascinating about Puzo's Godfather is this quality of reasonableness, so important for a leader and so unusual for a psychopath, that continues to come up both in the book and the movie. Vito Corleone is almost statesmanlike in his responses. Highly moralistic in his personal values, he is portrayed as having very strong views about appropriate public behavior, family honor, and sexuality in particular, and is seen to frown upon social inappropriateness of any kind. He's particular about language and its usage, and he reserves his strongest rebuke, infamita, to markedly inoffensive situations. Even so, it conveys squarely to those around him his displeasure about a person, that person's statements or actions. But what strikes one is that right through the book and the movie, the Godfather stands out for his willingness to negotiate. "I will reason with them" is his favorite refrain when confronted with a difficult situation. The primary quality of psychopathy that the Godfather therefore possesses appears to be the ability to be ruthless in achieving his own ends. The second psychopathic quality the Godfather exudes is a distorted reality of the impact of his actions, not quite consonant with traditional expectations or social beliefs, or indeed particularly empathetic. A third, most striking psychopathic quality the Godfather possesses is his ability to manipulate people and situations rather skillfully. His dispensation of favors is usually with a caveat that one day, at an appropriate time, the favors will have to be returned. Hesitation to accept or return the Godfather's favor is viewed with open contempt, suspicion, even derision. Quite contrary to the typical psychopathic personality, the Godfather is slow to warm up, even phlegmatic in his temperament, and he does not exude a superficial charm. Nor does he lose control over his emotions at any point in time, whatever the provocation. Indeed, he regards the inability to control one's emotions as being an animal quality unbecoming of a sensible human being. He is also a remarkably sensitive personality, quick to take offense, and very perceptive of the moods, emotions, and reactions of those around him. His ability to perceive social and emotional cues is highly developed, quite unlike the conventional psychopath who appears oblivious to these. Finally, his almost statesmanlike willingness to reason makes him stand out from the conventional image we have of the psychopath as a society. And the reason I've called this the Godfather paradox is because Puso's Godfather does therefore present us with a paradox. Cruel psychopath to some, beloved friend and protector to others. A unique combination of sense and sensibility on the one hand, balanced against latent potential for ruthless violence. Does he therefore represent for us the caricature of the socially enabled psychopath is the question that we ask. One particular incident in both the book and the movie do stand out. With a movie producer who refuses to acknowledge or return the Godfather's favor, but owns a beautiful horse, a one-of-a-kind horse, what the Godfather does is to behead the horse and to place it on his bedside table, place the head on its bedside table for the producer to see when he wakes up from sleep. You can imagine the impact of that single action. So there is this ruthlessness, there is this cruelty, yet it comes from beneath a demeanor of exceeding calm and willingness to negotiate. And that is the paradox that we are talking about. I'm going to go back to the psychopathic personality and talk about a few things that help us distinguish people as having psychopathic traits. From an interpersonal perspective, psychopaths have a glib, superficial charm. They have a grandiose sense of self-worth about them. They will come across as feeling very self-important. They tend to be pathological liars. They tend to be cunning and manipulative. From an emotional, affective perspective, they lack remorse or guilt, as I've already said. Their feelings are very fleeting. They quickly pass. They can often be very callous. They lack empathy, the ability to put themselves in the shoes of their fellow men. And they fail repeatedly to accept responsibility. From a lifestyle perspective, they need stimulation. They're very prone for boredom. Their lifestyle can often be very parasitic, and they often tend to be feeding off others, either with their knowledge or without. They often lack realistic long-term goals, and they can often be very impulsive and irresponsible. And from an antisocial perspective, they have poor behavioral control. They are born with early behavior problems. Indeed, many are hyperactive, have what we call oppositional defiant disorder in childhood or conduct disorder. There is often a history of juvenile delinquency, and they often have criminal tendencies, are prone to repeat offenses. Now, from a neuroscience perspective, what differentiates those with positive psychopathic attributes? A famous serial killer in our history is Ted Bundy. And what we learned by studying him was that psychopaths zero in on weaknesses. For example, Bundy picked out his victims from the way that they walked. The other very interesting thing about very functional psychopaths is that they can be ice cool under pressure. Several experiments have shown that those with psychopathic traits are not nervous when they are under pressure. They certainly don't feel emotions the way other people do. And very often, functional psychopaths tend to balance an attitude for predatory violence with enhanced empathy, the ability to get under the skin of their victims. And those are very unique qualities. In his book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Kevin Dutton, a professor of psychology from Oxford, puts forward two moral dilemmas. In the first, he says there's a railway trolley that is hurtling down a track. In its path are 5 people who are trapped on the line and cannot escape. Fortunately, you, the person, are in a position where you can flip a switch that will divert the trolley down the fork in the track and away from those 5 people. But there is a price. There is one person trapped down the fork and the trolley will kill them instead. And the question that's being asked of us is that if we had the lever to pull, would we pull it? would we save the 5 people at the expense of 1 life? That's the first moral dilemma. The second moral dilemma he puts forth is this, that as before, there's a railway trolley that is speeding out of control towards 5 people. But this time, you're standing above on a footbridge, and in front of you is a very large stranger. And the only way to save those 5 people is to push this guy away from the footbridge onto the tracks so that the trolley stops, and therefore those 5 lives are saved. Will you push the guy? Now, these are 2 very, very interesting circumstances. In the first, all you have to do is flip a switch, and 1 person will die and 5 will be saved. In the second, you are an more active participant. What you are doing is pushing someone over from a bridge so that the trolley stops and 5 people are saved. And what he points out, that in the first case where you flip the switch, it is an impersonal moral dilemma. And parts of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, and these are activated, and these have been implicated in cold empathy, in reasoning, and in rational thought. But the second is a much more personal moral dilemma, because you're actively participating in killing someone in order to save 5 lives. And when this dilemma is presented to the psychopath, and the brains are studied in functional imaging, the very interesting finding is that there is, while for most of us, the brains light up when you're put in front of such a situation and you're trying to solve the problem, many parts of your brain involved in emotion, involved in decision making light up. In the psychopath, it's as if nothing happened. There is radio silence. And this is that whole quality of being ice cool under pressure that the functionally enabled psychopath or the socially enabled psychopath is able to possess in great measure. Very interestingly, studies have shown that business leaders and criminals are very similar to each other in the way that their brains process information. Borden Fritzen compared business managers and psychiatric patients with hospitalized criminals. Superficial charm, egocentricity, persuasiveness, lack of empathy, independence, and focus were all greater in the business leader. In the criminals, law-breaking, impulsivity, and physical aggression were the dials that were cranked up. But what they found was that both groups occupied a neuropsychological continuum. Indeed, from a biological perspective, it was as if it was the flip of a dice. You could become this very socially enabled psychopathic business leader, or indeed become this criminal who repeatedly offends and ends up in jail. And very little differentiated. The line was extremely thin. In the book, Dutton goes on to describe what he calls Arctic neurology. It's reported that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he was cool as cucumber, he barely broke sweat, and when the data was reassessed, his heart rate fell rather than rose at the time of landing. Most of us, our hearts would pound away like a trip hammer if we were in a spacecraft and for the first time ever as human beings, we were going to land it on the moon. You can imagine the moment. And yet in that moment, Neil Armstrong did not break sweat and his heart rate fell. Is this an isolated experience? No. In a study, Stanley Richmond looked at bomb disposal operatives. He identified those who had been in the profession for at least 10 years and divided them into the decorated and not decorated groups. The decorated groups had won medals for their valor. The non-decorated groups had the same experience but were not medal winners. Both groups had stable heart rates when they were working. However, in the decorated group, when they started disposing the bomb, and you can imagine this is a high pressure, tense situation that you're disposing a bomb, their heart rate actually went down. They seemed to assume a cold, meditative status. So, what appears biologically is the way the person who is wired in this way seems to be very different from most other people. When confronted with a pressure situation or when confronted with danger, they actually assume a position of intensely being cool. And they are physiologically different and their brains behave differently in those situations. And that seems to define the socially enabled psychopath or the functional psychopath. And we have no reason to believe that that's how successful business leaders are wired too. Very interestingly, we talked about business leaders and psychopaths. It's interesting that saints, seers, may share some of these qualities. So you look at what psychopaths represent: narcissism, impulsivity, lack of a conscience, manipulativeness, pathological lying, being cold and heartless. That's what they represent. What do the saints represent? Love, compassion, gentleness, humility, faithfulness, and trustworthiness. But there are common qualities: being stoic, being mindful, being fearless, being tough, being open to challenges, being utilitarian, having a sharp focus, being capable of having an altered consciousness, energy and creativity being very different, being non-attached, being detached. These are some common qualities that saints and psychopaths probably share. What they perhaps don't share is ruthlessness, empathy, and altruism. The psychopath is ruthless, the saint is empathetic and altruistic. So it's extremely interesting, therefore, that there is this interface between business leaders, saints, and socially enabled psychopaths, especially when it comes to success, especially when it comes to performance in high pressure situations or going through high pressure situations. One of the most interesting modern examples of a very functional person with many psychopathic qualities is Steve Jobs. And you only have to read his biography to understand this. Here are a few comments from his biography. Steve has a reality distortion field. In his presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. It wears off when he is not around, but it makes it hard to have realistic schedules. Someone else said, a confounding melange of charismatic, rhetorical style, indomitable will, and eagerness to bend any fact to fit the purpose at hand. The third, it came from willfully defying reality, not only to others, but to himself. He can deceive himself. A fourth, he reminded me of Rasputin. He laser beamed in on you and didn't blink. It did not matter if he was serving a strange purple juice, you drank it. A fifth, sometimes he would throw you off balance by suddenly adopting your position as his own, without acknowledging that he ever thought differently. Do some of these qualities sound familiar? Do you recognize these qualities in people around you? Perhaps the CEO of your company, the vice chancellor of the institution in which you work, or a business leader you have met? You probably do. And that is the functional person with psychopathic qualities, is what I would put to you. So you then need to ask yourself, who is the odd man out? Is Vito Corleone? the odd man out? Is Veerappan the odd man out? Is Steve Jobs the odd man out? And the answer really lies in which way you are looking at functionality in these three people. Please remember the commonality. None of these people probably perceived what they did as wrong. They had their own understanding of what reality was, what right and wrong was. They operated by their own rule book. That's the commonality. One was a violent criminal who died a violent end. If you follow the Godfather story, of course, you will understand what happened to the Godfather. And of course, there have been sequels concerning other members of the family. Wonderful characters that Mario Puzo created for us. And then, of course, there's Steve Jobs, a legend in our times, who did have, perhaps, as his biography and as many people who have spoken about him say, an altered sense of reality, of what was right and wrong, and of what he believed and what other people believed. And therefore, I think from Corleone to Jobs, we can think about how a quality like psychopathy, which is thought of as dysfunctional, something that will land you in prison, can actually make you extremely successful and very, very functional. I'll leave it there.